A question I get often from you guys when you're working on your first games is, how unique should my game be? Because usually either you want to immediately make an open world MMORPG or make like the next Elder Scrolls game, or you want to make a game that is like so out there and like none of the mechanics are something that like I really ever heard about, and I do know quite a bit of like different game mechanics, different game genres, because you're scared of copying other games. And I just want to make this video as a giant public service announcement that copying games is fine. Actually, I encourage you even to copy games to quite a high degree, especially for your first games. So in this video, I wanted to go a bit more over the reasons why you should copy games, how you do it the right way, how do you not like blatantly just rip off other games and actually get it to backfire. And also I want to dedicate like a little section at the end as well about what about assets, because that is something that I see a lot as well, because it's about more of the uniqueness, how unique should my game be, and you feel like even though you have zero 3D modeling skills, for example, you still feel like you have to make your entire game from scratch, which I think is dumb as well. And I think the first reason why you should copy other games is that having some game that has some familiarity to other games that your audience may have played before is going to make marketing infinitely easier than if you would make some game where none of the mechanics you really know, none of the mechanics make sense really, and your audience, when they look at your screenshots, for example, they actually have no idea what kind of game you're making. And this is also kind of what we did for our first game, Forge Industry, where we looked at games such as Factorio and Factory Town. Those were two big inspirations, and we saw, okay, what are some things that we really like and what are some twists that we can bring from our own? So honestly, Factorio and Factory Town are superior automation games compared to Forge Industry, obviously. But what we have is we have some different mechanics in terms of item transporting. And that alone is already enough for people to be like interested in our game, because we're doing something slightly different. And sure, we did still shoot ourselves a bit in the foot with like our art style, but even assuming we had a garbage art style, just the fact that people could look at the game and immediately see, hey, this is kind of like Factorio or this is kind of like Factory Town, but they're changing some things, has actually made our marketing a lot easier, even though we had no clue what we were doing. That's what I'm learning now when we're trying to market our second game, which we try to be a little bit more unique in certain regards and not copy as much, where marketing can get a lot harder if people don't really have a good example to draw inspiration from. When we went and we were at physical events showcasing Forge Industry, people would come up to us and be like, hey, what is this? And we could simply be like, hey, do you know Factorio or do you know Timberborn or whatever? And if their eyes like lighted up, we knew that they were pretty much going to be hooked in our game. So it just made marketing so much easier. And apart from purely familiarity, it can also be a deliberate move where you copy older games or older franchises and IPs where there hasn't been that much innovation anymore, where the fan base is really longing for more, and you come in and you bring that new breath of fresh air to the genre. One of the biggest examples right now of that is Spell World, where Game Freak has been just like absolutely neglecting the Pokemon games for the past 10 years. And then you suddenly have this other studio, even though like I wouldn't say the developers for Spell World are like true indies, the example still stands. They take that concept of Pokemon, so to say. They don't ever use the terms Pokemon on their own really, like in the game. It's sure, they're like very much copy certain characters, but then they add more innovation, such as more of an open world aspect that actually works. They add the combat system as well, and then you get Pokemon with guns, and people love it because that innovation hasn't been there. There are multiple other examples of this as well, such as for example Stormgate, which started because StarCraft 2 is still a really good real-time strategy game, and there haven't been that many alternatives that have just been able to get that good, who have been able to innovate on that. And looking at the state of Blizzard right now, they're not going to be touching that IP anytime soon. So then you get games like Stormgate, which is made up of some old ex-Blizzard developers who want to bring that innovation and who want to use that as a way to get more marketing. One final example I have here as well is more of an indie game, Rolling Rascals, which is basically Sonic. Like, look at the gameplay. I'll put it up right now. It looks like Sonic. The Sonic fan base, when they saw this, was like, this looks awesome, but nowhere do they actually say it is Sonic, but people just know like, hey, this is some innovation that we haven't really seen lately, which we really want to have. Which means that you will have an audience that's already there for your kind of game. If you're making a brand new kind of game, you won't have any audience yet who knows that they want that. Whereas if you're gonna make a new game that's like Sonic, the entire Sonic fan base pretty much is going to be interested in your game. Now there is like one little caveat I want to say here, that is you should understand the like fan base that you're going to be catering to in that regard. I think the Rolling Rascals, they did start from making just like simple fan games, and then they evolved into making an actual dedicated game. You need to understand where like the original IP holders have been lacking and how you can actually improve upon that. And then another strategy in terms of copying games, although I'm not really certain if this is the best for like brand new developers, is copying trends. So this is something that you saw a lot with Vampire Survivors, and now also with like some other games such as Exit 8, for example, where a game gets released, it has a lot of popularity, it has like a lot of virality. And what you do then is you have like 1 to 2 months basically, in which time you make another game that is pretty much exactly like the original, but adds like one more feature, for example. So with the survivor-like, you saw this a lot, such as for example with Crafty Survivors, which is a survivor-like, but you can craft in it as well. And it's released pretty soon after the original Vampire Survivors, so people were still interested in that kind of genre. It has died down a little bit at this point, but because they were so fast, there weren't that many competitors yet. There were plenty of other survivor-likes that came out as well, where the fastest you can really make a new game that is like not entirely garbage. But honestly, when you look at those games, some of them are like kind of garbage. Like Exit 8, for example, there's a meme version basically of Exit 8 that, even though the reviews are pretty bad, it has still sold more copies purely from the fact that it could snowball from that virality. So it's definitely something you can do, but you need to know your engine. You need to really know like, how do I quickly set up a prototype and how do I churn out some content so I can actually make this a full game. Now there are some things that I would want you to watch out for, however, and the main one honestly is when you're copying another game, don't ever use the original game's name in your marketing. It's like, I'm not a lawyer, I just like to talk to a camera basically, but having your name in like your trailers, for example, of like, this is like Factorial, but better, it's going to open you up to so many cease and desist opportunities or like other legal ramifications. And it's like, do you really want to risk that? Probably not. Your community will make those connections on their own if you like frame your trailer in the right way, but you as the developer should never say it out loud basically. That's one thing that I really want you to keep in mind. The developers of Palworld, they never said themselves that they're going to be making Pokemon with guns. That's just what the community made of it, and the developers ran with it because hey, that's what they were probably thinking, but they were smart enough to never put that in their trailer, to put that in their marketing materials. Also, once again, don't 100% blatantly rip off like certain models. You can draw inspiration from like characters or whatever if you're copying games, but don't just make carbon copies. Palworld kind of got away with it because they're just so big and they can just not give a fuck at some point. Whereas if you're like a solo indie dev and suddenly you're gonna get a letter from like the Disney company that your fan game needs to be shut down, there's not much you're going to be able to do against that. So try and keep your direct references pretty low key still. Also, always try to add something of your own. Don't make a 100% copy of another game. This is only good if you're trying out like prototypes that are never going to leave your engine, that are never going to be put on Steam. But honestly, at that point, I would just rather focus on copying like 90% of another game and then adding another 30% of your own stuff. I know the mod doesn't work out there, but I think that you should always improve the game that you're working off originally in some capacity. Like, there are multiple ways you can do this. It doesn't need to be new mechanics. It could be things like having a different kind of narrative linked to the gameplay. Or it could be taking a 2D game and turning it into 3D. Maybe there are some different mechanics that appear that way, but always add something new. Don't just blatantly copy what another game is doing. Always try and figure out at least some small part that is new. And yeah, know that you're always going to get like some hate probably of being like, hey, you ripped off this game, but honestly, gamers, they're always gonna be like that. Gamers are always gonna find a reason to be salty at you and find a reason to get mad at you. As long as you kind of handle in good faith and you don't just blatantly rip off like everything from another game and just make it like an asset kind of flip game that is pretty much the exact same with no innovation, with no new ideas to the table, you should still be fine. It's like, you're gonna get these kinds of comments. There's not much you can do about it. Just once you see them, it's gonna hurt, but then move on. Speaking of those asset flips, that's something that I see a lot of people like very worried about as well. And like, especially with like the 3D assets, because most of our audience, 75% is programmers, like I said, you're not 3D artists, like at all. And I get that. We're not 3D artists either, but still, you do need a pretty good art style for your game if you want to really take it to the next level marketing wise. And what a lot of people do then is they go to asset packs such as Cinti. And this is once again where a lot of developers are like, but if I only use Cinti assets, isn't my game going to look incredibly generic? And yes, it is maybe going to be a little bit, but there are a few ways you can solve this. The first one that I really like is doing things like shaders, where you don't just use the base Cinti assets and you don't just use the base lighting of your engine so it looks very generic, but actually try and play around with like tweaking the color profiles, maybe like putting a toon shader on it so that you have the models there, but they don't look the same as every other game. Another thing that is like specific to Cinti, this part goes mainly about Cinti because they're just so giant, but this goes for other like asset packs as well. We've made a video a long time ago about like do it yourself versus should you use asset packs. Is Cinti has this issue where the characters are incredibly recognizable. The props, not as much. Use the props as much as you want is what I would say, but if you can, get custom characters, get custom 3D models for those, because those are going to be the thing that your player stares at the most. Now, if you can't do that, don't worry. There are still so many games that have been able to be successful using purely Cinti assets, because it is probably still going to look better to use the generic Cinti assets versus you trying to make some honestly pretty bad models, pretty bad props, and it's gonna cost you a lot of extra development time that you probably don't have the skills for yet. It's much better to just make a game that then looks like, sure, a little bit generic, but at least it looks decent still. That's something that Cinti does really well. Any Cinti asset pack, basically, you're going to get a game that looks decent. It may not be a perfect, like extreme visual standout, but you're probably going to be able already to sell a lot more copies just from having that somewhat consistent art style versus you having to try out 17 different styles in Blender and then just throwing them all together, but not really taking into account like different scaling sizes and things like that. So those are some of my thoughts about should you copy other games. Honestly, like I said, your first games especially, just copy quite a bit of other games because it's going to make your market research a lot easier. I get questions about that as well, like how do I do optimal market research? Well, look at games that are similar to yours that have been released in the past 3 years that honestly you feel like, hey, I could take this, I really enjoy this kind of game maybe, but I think I can improve it. Just go with that, make that kind of game, and you are going to be doing pretty solid. Like sure, you can go for the completely unique game idea, but chances are you're not like a very talented game designer either, and that's all right. Maybe your skills lie in the 3D art, or maybe your skills lie in the programming. Stick to those, use your unfair advantages, and then just make games to improve that way and figure out what's my style, what are my talents even more, and then your future games you can try and venture out a little bit more into making something uniquer, something more special, and making that a success. Anyways, that's all I have to say. If you're interested into this kind of game development related content, be sure to head down below and subscribe, as it really helps us out. And in exchange, you get 2 videos every week where we talk more about the experiences that we have making our own games and the things we've learned along the way, the times we've failed and the lessons we've taken, for example, from those failures. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!